Jesus is sort of wrapped in all of these symbols. And I could take you into every other gospel. I don't know that I've got time to do it this morning. But I could take you into every other gospel and show you that the Jesus story is constantly having the Hebrew Scriptures wrapped around it. By the time the Gospels appear, they are deeply Jewish documents. Now, where could that have happened? There's only one place, and that's in the synagogue. Why? Because people didn't own books in those days. Books were expensive. Books had to be hand-copied. Books were community property. The only place you ever heard the Scriptures read was in the synagogue. The only place you ever heard the Scriptures interpreted was in the synagogue. So when the Gospels are written, Jesus is already wrapped into the Hebrew Scriptures, interpreted through the Hebrew Scriptures. And that could only have happened in the synagogue. And there was no Gideon Society to put the Scriptures in your hotel room. You know, people didn't own them. So that the very fact that by the time the Gospels make their appearance, Jesus is constantly interpreted inside the Hebrew symbols of their messianic expectations indicates that Jesus was passed on by word of mouth, not by two people having to meet on the street corner, but he was passed on by word of mouth to people in the synagogue. Christians today aren't even familiar with the synagogue. You don't even have any idea what happens in the synagogue. But if you read the 13th chapter of the book of Acts, Luke captures a synagogue service and tells you what the liturgy is. After the reading of the law and the prophets, they invite the people to stand up and bring a message. And the Christians, the disciples of Jesus, who were Jews, who were in the synagogue, would stand up and they would relate a Jesus story to the Scriptures that were read that day. And that happened Sabbath after Sabbath, month after month, year after year, for between 30 and 70, 40 years, 2 generations, before the Gospels began to emerge out of this preaching tradition. So if we can, and I'll start it next week, if we can go back and capture something of first century Jewish synagogue worship, and then listen to the Jesus story in terms of that synagogue worship, then the Gospels will begin to open up in incredible new directions. And you can see a way to read these stories non-literally, because that's the way the Gospel writers wrote them. They were interpreting Jesus non-literally against the background of Jewish Scriptures. Well, that's about 2/3 of what I hope to get through today, but I do want to go to church. And Janet wants all of you to come to church, but let's take a couple minutes and see if there are any questions we can address. And I follow the procedure that every other question has to come from a woman. And I like the first one to come from a woman. Yes, ma'am?
I have a question. What do you think about the other Gospels? Gospels of Thomas, Gospels of Mary Magdalene. How come they didn't look like the Bible?
Well, they're all different. So if I were to answer that, I'd have to take each one of them. Thomas is... Oh, I'm sorry. What do I think about the other Gospels, the ones that didn't make it into the book? There's only one of them that there's great debate in Christian circles about its authenticity, and that's Thomas. And Thomas, we didn't even know Thomas existed until we had the discovery of Nag Hammadi in about 1946. Thomas is an interesting book. It's one chapter, about 110 verses. You can read it in 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And there is a strong argument. Some of my colleagues in the Jesus Seminar certainly made that argument that it's a very early book. I'm not convinced by that argument. I think it's sort of 125 or so, but that's neither here nor there. One of my favorite theologians in the world teaches at Princeton. Her name is Elaine Pagels, and she's fantastic. And she's written a book called Beyond Belief, where she makes a very strong case for the early authenticity of Thomas. The Jesus Seminar has put Thomas into the canon. They've written a book called The Five Gospels, and Thomas is the fifth. So that's the one you can make the strongest case for. Once you get past that, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of James, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, you're talking about 2nd and even 3rd century works, and they get more and more magical and more miraculous. In one of them, I can't remember which, Jesus is playing as a child on the Sabbath, and he's making little mud pies in the shapes of birds. And some of the religious figures come along, and they see him working on the Sabbath. And so Jesus zaps them, and they all become living and fly off, so the evidence disappears. Well, it's kind of cute story and kind of fanciful, but it's hardly biblical. I mean, it's hardly authentic. And when I was preaching on the 19th, I used a reference from the Gospel of James. That's about 175. And that Gospel purports to tell you how Mary was prepared as a little child to become the mother of Jesus. And how when they wanted to get her married, because you have to be married in a patriarchal society to have a male protector, they wanted to have a kind of male protector who would not violate her virginity so that she could be the Virgin Mother. And that sort of narrowed the field of those people that wanted to volunteer to be Mary's husband. And so they went around and they only looked at people who were widowers with grown children. And this is to repeat that sermon, but anyway, they picked Joseph because he had grown children, and he was very old, and he was too old to have any interest in sex. Well, I don't know how old that is, but that's pretty old. And that's the way they preserved her virginity, because as the story of Mary developed through history, she was first the Virgin Mother, and then she was the permanent virgin, and then she was the postpartum virgin, and then she was immaculately conceived, and then she was bodily assumed. So Mary did a lot of growing, and none of that's in the Bible. Virgin Mother is in the Bible, but only in 2 places, and as I say, based on mistranslation. But all of that sort of shows you how the tradition develops. And these other Gospels are fanciful and much more complex, and much more miraculous, and much more supernatural. And so, you know, you can read them, but they're not of any, I don't think they're of any great benefit in helping us form the story. But gentlemen, this better be our last one. I see people already vested, drinking coffee so they can stay awake in church. Yes?
The 4 gospel writers know one another.
I don't think so. We don't have any idea who they were. You know, all of the names on the 4 Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, were names attributed to those works well after the fact. The best case can be made for the least well-known. Mark and Luke are the least well-known. And you can make a better case for somebody like Mark, who does appear in the story in the book of Acts, and Luke, who appears a couple of times in Pauline and pseudo-Pauline epistles as a companion of Paul, that maybe there's some authentic connection. When you get to Matthew and John, I think it's fair to say that none of them are eyewitness accounts, that all of them are 2nd to 3rd generation accounts. John is described in the book of Acts as an uneducated fisherman. He hardly could write Greek, and this gospel is written in Greek. But that's just sort of something that skips by when people try to make a case, because the fundamentalist approach is always to have these be sort of as early as possible. I told you a story about my appearance on Tom, what was his last name? Tom Snyder's late night program back in the early 90s when I was roaming around. And Tom, who was raised as a Roman Catholic, I was beginning to show him when these books were written, and he said, well, you know, they can't be eyewitnesses. And I said, no, they don't claim to be eyewitnesses. Luke tells you he's gone around and done research before he writes from several documents. But Tom said, well, that's not what the nuns taught him. I said, Tom, what did the nuns teach you? And excuse me for repeating this. He said, they taught me that the disciples followed Jesus around and wrote down everything he said, and that's where we got the gospel. And I said, Tom, did the nuns tell you that they used ballpoint pens and spiral notebooks? And you could see his face, you know. It's really kind of fascinating. That's so simple. Parchment was incredibly expensive. Less than 1/10 of 1% of the people in the first century could write. That's why we have scribes in the Bible. If you wanted something written, you took it to one of the few people in society who could write, and you paid him or her, probably him, because they didn't let women get educated, and he would write it for you. But that's I mean, what we have done is to read back our history, our life on the first century, and pretend there's no great dislocation in that. Well, see you next week. Love being with you. Go to church.